Alright, Humies, let's get this over with. We've got our designer UI in front of us, right? So let's get started. First of all, as like with any other piece of software, you've got the top bar, which is File Edit Tools, Windows. I'm not going to go over this just yet. I mean, there's only one or two things that we need to worry ourselves with. Then you've got the Explorer, which sort of holds in all of the assets that you have, graphs, etc. You can even click this little button to like for whatever you select here to give you info about it, but it's kind of pointless really, because presumably whatever you have here, unless it's super complicated, you should know what it is. Then you've got the graph window, which is generally speaking the main window, where you will be sort of coding your substance, programming your substance, like processing images, etc. Then you've got the 2D and 3D views, which show your whatever you're working with in 2D view and 3D view, respectively. And then, of course, you've got your parameters tab, which is where sort of like where the magic happens. And then you've got the library. Now, the library, in my opinion, is the most useless bit, assuming, of course, you don't, decide to add your own stuff in the library. But generally speaking, the library is just a bunch of filters on their own. I mean, of course, the search bar is pretty much identical to that in Painter, so it kind of defeats the purpose of, well, I mean, I'm not going to explain how this works. It's the same as Painter. And then, of course, you've got the library itself here in the tabs. You can define your own folders, tags, etc., when you import and stuff. And speaking of that, let's go over the settings here. So first of all, where's my, there we go, edit preferences. Now, if we take a look here, there's really not that much. You only have the library, which basically has nothing in it right now. We've got the 3D view, which essentially, let's say, for example, the refresh rates. You can, like, these things are standard, basically. You've got the graph settings, which are few and far between. You've got the iRay, which is responsible for, rendering, and that's something we're not going to be doing anyway, so that's fine. Then you've got the projects. Now, as the last one we're going to go over, but in general here, if we take a look, we've got some interesting settings. First of all, you've got the amount of risk document lists, which is your prerogative, just 10 files or whatever. Then you've got the history stack. 200 states is basically huge, so if you're 200 steps ahead and you decide to, oh shit, I fucked up at the beginning, yeah, I mean, that's quite a lot of backtracking. So 200 states is, in my opinion, plenty. And technically speaking, you shouldn't need more than 10, maybe 20 at most. And then you've got your language, you've got your views. The save export paths are fairly interesting. These are just the temp folders, etc. Thumbnail cache, just basic cache sizes. These usually use your C drive. So if you're kind of low on C drive space, don't go nuts on these images here, on these on these sizes here. Then you've got the user interface start. Well, I really don't know what that high DPI is, and probably no point assembling it. I mean, I know what DPI stands for. It's just, what does that dots per inch? Oh, right, I get it. Okay, never mind. Point is, you just leave this off. Then you've got the backup, which is, well, fairly simple. Then you've got the cooker, which essentially tells you what's the maximum resolution you'll be working with. That's not to say that you'll be limited to 4K, at export or something, or even at creation, but you could max this out if you really want to. Then you've got the engine GPU cache, which is essentially depending on how much memory you've got on your graphics card. I got 4, but using half of it is just fine, because well, I don't know, maybe you could increase it to 3, but I don't see any particular slowdown. Well, I do see a little bit. So let's say I increase it to 3 in a later video, but for now we'll just leave it at 2K. Then we've got the projects. Now this is the actually interesting tab, since that's the stuff that kind of like enables you to do some pretty cool things. As you can see here, we've got the 3D view things, such as default shaders, your default environment map, which you can change, but then again, you can change it at runtime as well. There's no need to, go digging into the project files all the time. And of course, you've got your default state, which is just created in your, temporary app data. Now, all of these settings over here, you can export them as a user project, and you can just, a custom project sort of settings, and then you can just import them, share it between team members or whatever. So you can definitely, save these configuration files, and everything you have here will be, will be also exported with it. Then you've got your aliases, which is simply an alias. You can add different idols to different directories so that you can just use this. Sort of shorthand representation of this whole directory instead of just typing the whole thing. Then you've got the Baker settings, which here, for example, you get to define what's the using wildcards, of course, in these signals here. Symbols here. You get to define how your exported maps will actually be named, or whenever you bake something, I mean not exported, because you'll be exporting presumably substances. If you're going to export maps, you use Painter. Right, so you can just change these. I'm not going to leave them at default. There's quite a few, by the way. So if you're going to define something custom, just add them here and just create a new set, a preset here. Then you've got your submesh names. These are for your baker. Here you can actually change them for a good long time, like the low and the high. If you're going to be baking a normal map off of something. Then you've got the general settings, which allows you to set up some different templates and then change the tangent space. Since we're working with Unreal Engine 4, the MICT space is what Unreal Engine 4 uses, and that is also what Painter uses, well, Substance in general uses. So just leave it as it is. Of course, if you're doing something else fancy, go ahead and point this this plugin URL to your to whatever tangent space you're using. Then you've got your default normal map format, which is OpenGL. Now, generally speaking, you might want to have this at DirectX, since basically the difference between DirectX and OpenGL is that OpenGL is kind of like the opposite. One of the channels is actually inverted. It's kind of like the roughness and the glossiness type deal. I mean, one is the inversion of the other. So really, if you have a particular map that is in OpenGL, you can obviously change it to DirectX. Now I'm going to go ahead and just put this in DirectX, since we'll be making games for Windows, presumably. Not to mention, well, I mean, OpenGL works as well, but whatever. Then here's a question: do you need the alpha or not? Now, I think it's nice to have this on. Like whatever you dump into there will be like some alpha. You can obviously remove it after that if you want, using levels or whatnot. But it's up to you. Then you've got your image formats: TIFF, TGA, PNG, JPEG, BMP. All these are just simply settings for these. For example, the compression ratio of your JPEGs, you can obviously optimize them, increase the quality. Obviously, this will increase also the actual output size. When you go to Targas, there's really not that much. There's only one setting here for compression. And the PNG, you might, depending on what you're exporting, if it's something animated, you might want to have it interlaced. Sorry, not animated, but actually, did PNG support animation? I don't think it did. Well, interlace basically will kind of like de-interlace the stuff. Then you've got your version control. This is actually the more interesting bit. Now, I skipped over MDL because I don't deal with that stuff, and I really don't know what the whole rage is all about when it comes to the MDL. Then you've got the scripting here. You can define your own actions, and obviously you need to define an interpolator. So if you're creating something that is using Python, you need to actually add, the Python executable in order to interpolate and read whatever scripts you've written. Same thing applies for version control. Now, I'm not going to set this up in this video since it's kind of redundant in my opinion. Oh, maybe it isn't. I don't know. It's up to you. I just can't be bothered with it right now since we're not going to really be making this huge project, and it's just not worth it for only one substance, because that's all I'm going to export from here. Depending, of course, on your project, you might want to be having that. Now, the simple way this works is you simply create obviously you add a workspace here, but we already have one added. So you enable the version control, you write down the exact name of your workspace, you write down the path of your workspace, obviously exactly in that, and then you need to add a particular set of actions, which are essentially Python scripts. Best way to do so is to add an action over here, and then you would go into tools. Obviously this is within the designer directory, so every designer directory should have that. You've got your version control. In this case, it's got perforce. You would enable you would basically load this. It will sort of like load all of these, basically change all these actions to appropriate settings here, and then you need to add an interpolator here, which would of course be your Python interpolator if you're using a Py. So you'd be going like Python, and then you would go ahead and find your Python executable and essentially point it towards, point the Substance Designer towards this executable so that it can run it every time you decide to well, use a particular command. It's fairly self-explanatory. Oh yeah, in order to get it to really work, you need to, let's just go ahead, and I think I copied this. Yes, I did. So here are the tools. You need to open it up, and here you would have to change your, your P4 path. So it's like, where is your P4 executable? In this case, I don't really know where exactly the damn thing is. It could be in program files, could be in x86 files. Really have no idea. And like I said, I'm not going to be bothering setting this up. But generally, all you need to do is set this up to, pointing to your P4 P4 executable. And then essentially what will happen is every time you right click and do some of these commands, such as add, checkout, check-in, etc., they will be run by the Python interpolator, and will be passed into P4V. Perforce, essentially. Okay, so that's how you set up your version control. That is assuming, of course, you need it. You can also set up your custom scripts and your custom commands here if you really want to. If you're using something else, like maybe if you're using Turtle or whatever it was called, and then you could even use Git, I think. But it's kind of pointless using Git for this, especially since, well, at this stage, Perforce is far superior when it comes to binaries. Of course, Git can also maintain them, but it's not made for that. So that's basically it, guys. When it comes to project settings and your general settings here, there's really not that many settings to go through all in all. The most important ones were oh crap, we almost forgot. My bad. Here you've got your library, so you would add, for example, different paths to a particular library, and then it will be shown over here, and of course subsequently be shown over here on the left side once you set it up. Okay, so let's go ahead and create a new substance, shall we? Let's create a new substance, and for this particular video I'm just gonna go with empty. Reason for that is the difference between all of these different sort of templates is that they have different outputs. For example, look at this, man. The AXF has so many outputs, it's ridiculous. A Studio Panorama only has one output, in other words, a panorama. If you're going to be making a cube map, for example, you can create painter generators, which only have one output. Painter filters would have a bunch of them, and obviously this is not set in stone. You can change them on your own. So let's just create an empty graph. I'm going to call this a test graph, and we're going to go over what we have here. Now, first of all, on the left side here, it's important to understand that this package involves a lot of things. Now you can just write something here in this test graph and export the package itself, and the package will only have the test graph. However, there's many times where you would need to create, let's say, something like a new folder. Oops, my bad. Here, new folder, and then let's say write down, well, these are my, can you just rename this thing? These are my, let's say, helpers or utilities or whatever, and you have a couple of graphs here that are just responsible for being fed into the main graph. So let's say I create another one here and say I need another substance graph. By the way, notice that you can create a bunch of different things such as a bitmap and a graphics, and you can also import Photoshop documents. Let's create a new graph here, and I'm going to rename this into let's say, well, utility. So whatever I have in utility needs to not be computed, since at the end of the day I want to be exporting this whole package, right? And like I said before, you have different ways of exporting this. You could, let's say, you could export this with dependencies, which means that you're going to export the SBAR, the SBSAR, and the SBS as well. Or you could just publish the the SBSAR on its own, which is by clicking this button here. Of course, saving will only save the SBS on their own. Okay, so remember, the SBS is the project file, so to speak, which allows you to edit stuff. SBSAR is the the stuff you export into for general use. This is what anyone can use. All right, SBS can only be used by Painter and Substance. So that, just so you know, okay. And you can obviously have some dependencies. If you have different dependencies, you can just manage them here, such as different packages. But generally speaking, you might, like if it's a helper function, you'll probably have it inside your user package. Now the same thing goes for the user package, by the way. You can just publish either this, you can either publish the substance package, or you could, I think you can publish a graph on its own. Yeah, you could just export the bitmaps, but you cannot publish the graph on its own, which is quite weird. I thought it was possible. Well, that's a pity, but yeah. Now then, essentially, you need to package a substance differently. So if, let's say you create a pebbles substance and you create a sand substance. If you want to have sand with pebbles, you're gonna obviously want to mix them together. However, if you had your sand, for example, or your pebbles as a helper here, you would basically have them in one package, and then you'll be able to only import the, for example, the whole package, which would have these two graphs inside it. Now, when it comes to these graphs, I wanted to mention something important here. If we take a look at the attributes here, it says outputs computation. Now, what that means is that whenever you have something, let's say in this case we're going to use the sand and the pebbles. Imagine that my test is my sand, which is a basic material which can be used, for loads of different things. And then my my helpers here, the utility, is something that is responsible for the pebbles themselves, for example. Obviously, these pebbles, if I export it, I would be able to use them, since I would be presumably blending these two together. But at the end of the day, I will have to be calculating this thing's outputs kind of like as a map on its own, not just feeding it into to blend into something, right? So this means that I would have double the outputs. And if I have 3 or 4 or 5 or 10 materials, which would have, like, let's say 10 packages here previously saved in this package, then I would be creating a lot of computational clutter that is generally not needed, because again, I only need the final result, so the result of the blend. So if I have the pebbles and the sand, I want to see the sand with the pebbles. I don't want to see just the sand or just the pebbles. I want to see the final product. So if I keep this on, I will be basically cluttering my my output baker, so to speak, like generators. That it's just no point, right? So you just turn this off for your helper functions, and generally functions that generally graphs and materials that won't be viewed. Okay, you want only your final material to be outputted, so make sure to do that. Of course, speaking of the properties tab, there's a bunch of these things here. For example, the base parameters are part of the the base parameters are everywhere. Then you've got the attributes, which you can set up, such as tags, the author, the labels, the categories. You can even set descriptions up, and of course the identifier itself. These are all just different naming bits. Of course, the categories, once they match, they will actually be grouped, right? And the label is used for easier identification whenever you're looking for something. I don't know what that physical size is for. Presumably it has to do something with the substance itself. And then you got the icon for, for the substance whenever you have it. And you can even show it in the library, which is pretty cool. Then you've got your input parameters. Now, in this case, we really don't have any set up. But whenever you have a parameter set up, you can either obviously add it from here or promote it from somewhere within the graph itself. It's kind of like the controls, right? Remember, we had different input parameters for, for that painter material in the previous video, where we'll be setting, the size of the normal, how much the height is scaled, etc., etc. And these were all input parameters that would be exposed in Designer, in over here. So whenever you have anything exposed, it will be in your input parameters tab. Let me just collapse the attributes real quick. Same thing goes for input images. That is assuming you're actually using something as an input. You could be using a particular set of images, and of course you'd be outputting a particular set of images. In this case, we don't really output anything yet anyway. So then we've got the 2D view, you've got the 3D view, fairly self-explanatory, and like I already said, the library. Now the reason I kind of said that the library is kind of pointless is because, let me just, of course you can, by the way, rearrange all of these. You can rearrange all of these tabs over here, much the same way you'd be rearranging, much the same way you'd be rearranging them in Painter. So you're really not, you shouldn't be too worried. Of course, some of these, most of the controls sort of work just like the rest of them, so you could press F. Unfortunately, I didn't really find out a particular way of maxing it out. In fact, I'm not really seeing here, I haven't exactly seen any preferences when it comes to keybinds. So there's that. So that's a pity, but maybe I'm missing something. And again, in this case, it's not really that important. Now, if I go ahead and take a look at my package by double clicking in this sort of empty graph, it will immediately take me to the root of my graph, which is currently test. As you can see here, I'm currently in the test graph, and I'm seeing the stuff for the test. Now, generally speaking, if we take a look at the output size here, this essentially means what's the maximum output of a particular image. And let's just say I grab some color. So let's just go ahead and grab some uniform color. Now let's take a look at this thing. It's got 0.7 milliseconds of a computation time, creation time, and then we've got it's 256 by 256 color 8-bit. Okay, so it's an 8-bit color. If I double click this, of course, you will see that I have a master. This is the base parameters of my entire graph. So currently my resolution is parent times 1 and parent times 1 in terms of width and height. Currently it's set to relative to parent, of course, so whatever we decide that we need in terms of resolution, it will be automatically adjusted. Now you don't want to be generally setting this bit up, okay? So as you can see here, we're right now at whatever 4K, but currently, as you can see, it's parent x28, which is ridiculously high. Like if we keep this as it is, we might actually run into trouble. So generally speaking, it's much better to keep it this at 0, and whenever you're working with a graph, to go ahead and change it to absolute. Now the absolute bit is obviously not what you want, since you want to be able to change it, but since you want to be also working properly, we will go ahead and let's say pump this up to 1K. As you can see, we're up to 1 millisecond from 0. Whatever many, right? So you can actually right click here and you take a look at the different things that you can work with. Of course, spacebar does the same thing, but right clicking also allows you to add these different nodes, comments, or frames. You can even view outputs in 3D view, assuming you have some outputs at all. And then you can compute the nodes and thumbnails, which let's say we do this again, it's still 1.6. You can even clear them if you're not using them. It's just like kind of cleaning thing, and you can save the package. Of course, you got some basic functions such as paste without link, copy selection, etc., etc. Now, speaking of pasting and linking, you can actually import a lot of stuff here from the Explorer. If we take a look here, you can, let's say, import a bitmap or a vector graphics file, or you could link, a little bit more advanced stuff, such as, let's say, a font. You could link a 3D mesh, and I believe you can even link a PSD. Can you link a PSD? I think you can link a PSD. I'm not seeing it here. I think you just drag and drop. I think I've used this before as a, with a Photoshop document, but you'd have to recheck if you're using that. I'm pretty sure the bitmap actually covers the Photoshop document on its own. Maybe the vector graphics does, I don't know. The point is that once you link it, it will be part of your resources folder. So it'll allow you to, because it's linked, right? It's not going to be actually embedded in the final result. Well, I mean, it will be depending on what you're using it for, but let's say a mesh. If you link a mesh, you're not going to be exporting a mesh here. It's not going to be inside the substance. This is just a resource you use just to look at what you're doing, what you've created. So if we double click this over here again, you'll notice that we set it up to 10K to 1K. Then you've got your pixel size, which you should always leave at 1, generally speaking. And then you've got your output format. Now in this case, it's 8 bits per channel because we've set it up presumably to be 8 bits per channel. And that's currently relative to parent. In fact, everything here is currently relative to parent. However, you can go absolute and define very high pixel density, channel density, but 8 bits generally is normal, since you don't want to be cluttering your substance with quite a lot of stuff. All right, so I'm going to keep this at relative to parent. Right, then we've got your tiling mode and your random seed. Generally speaking, just whatever number you input here will be fine. Notice, by the way, that you can drag something, for example, to 10, and if 10 is not enough, you could double click and add a bunch more situations here, okay? Once you realize that this is, a little bit too much, by the way, you can also go negative, so let's say this, the negative bit would be pretty cool if you really need to work with something in the negative zone. But whenever you're tired, just go ahead and reset the default value, and it's currently at 0. Just reset it again. Okay, so for some reason it decided to keep my it kind of fucked up with the minus here, but whatever, just reset it to default value. Generally speaking, this should kind of like equalize your slide bar here. We already talked about the attributes bit, and the cool thing here is, let's just say over here I decide to use I don't know, let's say green. Now notice right now that if I go ahead and just Control D this duplicate it, right, and make this yellow, despite the fact that I've clicked on the green one, okay, currently I'm on the green one, right, you can see here, yeah, but on my in my 2D view here, I'm actually in the yellow. So what kind of what gives. Reason being is that the workflow is as such allows you to, let's say I blend these two together, it'll allow me to take a look at the blend while working on something here, because when I select it, the attributes change. All right, so let's even go ahead and blend this thing, and you'll see what I mean. Now, in order to preview something over here, you need to double click it. So there we go. I've double clicked this, and I've double clicked that. And if I go ahead and just plug these two together, don't worry about the node yet. And right, so I'm looking at my blend mode right now. Now, generally speaking, let's say, for example, I do this, I add something like, I don't know, let's keep it nice and easy. Let's go add. This is a linear dodge, right? So technically speaking, if I change this to red, I should get a different output. And that's the idea, right? I'm looking at my output over here while I'm changing the color over here. That's why, this workflow is created. Now, generally speaking, you also want presumably an output for whatever it is you're working on, since currently we don't have anything, right? We only have a color, and it's just a texture, just a representation of what we can look at. So I'm going to go ahead and just type an output, add an output here. Again, just give me a second here before we dive into the the spacebar and all of this. Just look at this bottom view here. I'm just even gonna sort of, okay, maybe not the best idea. Maybe I should just make it a little bit bigger, like so. So take a look at this output right now. Currently, it doesn't know what it's being used for, since it's not even compiled. Now, currently the name is, of course, output. I'm just going to call it, let's just say, color for this particular. Of course, it's technically base color or albedo, right? Whatever you want to call it. But as you can see, you've got some attributes here, such as how many, what kind of format you want, what kind of floating points you want. Generally, default is best. You can set up the maps. The pyramid is essentially infinite, whereas these levels have a particular amount of they're a finite amount. And then you've got the usage. Essentially, it tells you, well, what are we going to use this output for, which I just renamed color. By the way, you can also have set up different conditions. In this case, it takes a particular syntax. It has to do something with, I don't know, something like this, whatever, and then you'd have to have some kind of, I think it was something along the lines of, where's my it had to be something like this, and you have to compare it with whatever, right? But it's kind of redundant for what we're about to do, since we don't really need to use that many outputs. Now, in terms of the output usage, you just basically add the item here and define what it is. Maybe you want to use just the red, the green, the blue, or the alpha colors. Maybe you just want the RGB on its own. So if we go ahead over here and take a look at our different settings, we've got diffuse and base color, which generally speaking sort of are like, well, they're not the same. So basically in our case, this would be the base color, since we're working with base color, rough metallic. So now essentially designer knows that this is presumably a base color. So whenever we do something over here, it should output the base color. Speaking of that, of course, you can add different things. This could be a mask and normal, a bump spec. Like, just look at the amount of stuff this could be. Like, there's a lot of potential outputs. And the only difference, of course, between doing it this way and, let's say, I'm going to create a new package, and I'm going to say new graph as well over in this new package. Let's just say I want to be using a physically based metallic roughness. The only difference here is that, of course, it will create all of these outputs for you. Otherwise, I would have to go ahead and do this by myself. Now, take a look. We even got the output images. In this case, we don't have any, because when I didn't bake any, I don't think they'll even pop up over here. The point is that when I click on something, I have the exact same settings over here on this side. Even you've got the identifier, which is roughness or whatever, and the label itself. And in this case, I kind of mislabeled them, since the roughness is, well, the identifier, and this is just what you see. The point is, there's another way to work, right? Of course, instead of having two packages, instead of having one package with two graphs, I could maybe put this graph on top of this package. Just copy and paste it, sort of, and then I would save this package and this package, or I would just create a new package and I would import both of these, allowing me to blend the the stuff the way I like. So graphs are usually just used as utilities, right? So just be sure to understand that. As you can see here, we've got different. These are our outputs. In our case, we only have the color output, and as you can see, it's with the same identifier that I've written here. So if I write down color, for example, with, let's say, base color, base color, and then we use material, which would be, sorry, the label, which would be base color. So if I go ahead and do this, now let's take a look at our color. Where's our thingy here? As you can see, it's a base color with the identifier of base color, right? So now that you understand that, of course, whatever resources you have will, you could always send them over to the other side. The point is that right now I could, let's say, hook this up over here, and I'm gonna have my base color being output. Now in this case, I only have, of course, just the base color. However, you have to understand that whatever outputs you have here will automatically be applied to whatever it is you're looking at right now. Speaking of the 3D view, while we're at it, I think it's best that we go over some of these options here. Now, of course, these over here are not really that that complicated. You could simply ignore them, and the only ones you really need to consider are the ones at the bottom. For example, if you have an alpha channel, you can disable or enable it. You can change, for example, which channels you want to be looking at, or maybe change the which mode you want to be in. So it could be just grayscale in this case, or obviously this. If you take a look, this will not change the grayscale. This will not change the color itself. Sorry, this will not change the output itself. It will only change the way you view it. All right. Then you've got your different settings here, such as the information bit, telling you, for example, you can even take a look at the histogram here. And let me just close this information, and for example, I'll be selecting I want to see what my story is here. So there's definitely loads of different information when it comes to whatever it is you're looking at, and then of course you got your sRGB mode. All right, just the simple standard stuff, right? Photo viewer. Then you've got your 3D view, which is a little bit more advanced, but not too much different from the one in in Painter itself. Difference being, for example, if you want to change the environment, you'd have to go to edit over here and edit the environment itself, not just like the viewer settings in Painter. A little bit more advanced. For example, it's visible or not visible, right? In this case, let's just leave this visible for the shits and giggles. Now, of course, you can change the. I think they should be able to change the. For some reason, I'm not able to change the light in my version now. I don't know why, but generally speaking, once you hold down Shift or just press C, you should be able to operate the light itself. Now, for some reason, I cannot move mine. I mean, I have to do this manually, so I don't know what the whole story is there. So, for some reason, like I said, I cannot do it with a shortcut. At least, not any way I can see. Let's try it again. No. I'm not even holding Shift right now, so that's quite unfortunate, but probably a bug. It might be fixed in the future. Probably not a bug. Whatever. I don't know if I made a mistake somewhere or not. Like I said, I'm not the biggest, the heaviest user of Designer. Anyway, if we go further down the line, we've got, of course, the scene, which you could, figure out what kind of shape you have, or you could even create, let's say, disable or enable it, and you can even import your own stuff, such as, let's say, you wanna, where's my thing here? Well, it will be over here once you have it actually as a resource link. We can set it up over here. You can even export a bunch of states. Then you've got your material, which is the more important bit. Of course, you can add different materials, and they will have whatever names, and all of them will have particular settings. So in this case, we've got a definition setup, which is generally better used for metallic glossiness. Of course, this is the default one, metallic roughness, my bad. But the specular glossiness is also useful if you decide to use it. And there's the parallax occlusion tessellation stuff that I was looking for the other day. Here's this is basically the way a height map will be kind of used. Then you've got the channel bits. Essentially, it shows you what kind of stuff you will be. Any output you have that is not over in this setup will not be used in the final rendering of the material. So let's say you have ambient occlusion. Let's say you have a displacement map or some kind of, I don't know, a mask, for example. Like this stuff is not going to be, it's not going to be sort of impacting the material, all right? Then you've got the edit button, which is the more important one. You can change, for example, if you have a base color, so you can disable this, and there will be you won't be using the texture here, right? Then, of course, you've got your scale for the height, which, by default is 0, and whenever you have a particular height, you won't really see anything, and you'll see exactly what I mean. Then you've got your DirectX normal, which currently is true because we've set this to be, by default, DirectX. and then you've got the tiling. In this case, you should almost always leave it at 1, but whenever you're done, just take a look at how this works. Then you can scale, of course, the UVs, which, why would you do that? I don't know, but whatever. So as you can see, really not a lot of stuff here. You've got your material, then you got your lights. Of course, you can change the color of the lights, you know, the way they look, what colors they output. Then you've got your camera settings, which changes, like you can go to perspective, you can save different images. You can even render stuff over here. If you click on the iRay, it will actually go ahead and render stuff. Maybe I should have gone ahead and changed this to OpenGL, because the default is OpenGL. As you can see, we're currently rendering. There's our settings. And you can even change the different rendering methods, or you can even, you know, set this up in a particular way. This is the rendering for our iRay. But let's keep it at OpenGL, since it's just more compatible. Generally speaking, OpenGL is more compatible than DirectX, since of course, you know, Mac. I don't think Mac actually, and Apple products don't. I don't think they operate with DirectX. So there's that, and of course you've got the wireframe display. If you have a particular mesh, you can use the axis to get like loads of different things. You can change the display here. And the environment itself, which we've already gone over. Now, that being said, let's double click on this empty graph here and simply add another output. Actually, before we do that, let's go over these settings here. First of all, you've got your, of course, your working sort of, well, shelf, kind of. Not shelf, but, well, ribbon. I don't know. But the same thing that is available over here is also available to you on spacebar. So whenever you press spacebar, these exact same, yeah, I'm even gonna click this. As you can see, we've got the, where's my bitmap? There's my bitmap over here. You've got your, what is this? I don't even know. This blend, then you've got the blur, then you've got the, what is that? Chars. You've got your curvature, DBI. There's a bunch of these. I really don't use that, so I don't know what they're. There's the levels, the normal, the hue, saturation, grayscale, dynamic gradient map, dynamic gradient map, I think. This is grayscale, warps, transform 3D text, sharpen. There's like some of them, of course, you can, and there's an output. You can create an output here. Also, you can have inputs, by the way. So just you know, be aware of that. If you create functions such as filters, filters essentially are the same as, the only difference between a filter and a let's say a substance is the fact that it's got an input. Okay, so a filter or a generator in this, or whatever, right, will have you know, some inputs. It will do something with these inputs, and then will output whatever the result is. So if you make your own filters, you know, just need to add inputs to them, and you know, they'll be working just fine. In fact, you can transform a lot of materials into filters just simply by adding inputs, and you know, getting rid of the source images and simply, you know, requesting other images, which is what a lot of people do, by the way. Right, so that's basically it when it comes to your top ribbon here. Of course, you've got your sizes here, if assuming you use any, and you've got your different settings. So in this case, for example, I would change my links to rectangle, which I prefer. There's different settings over here when it comes to the way you see your mode. So the compact material would be, let's say I add a, sorry, let's say I add a bricks material. It will. Yes, there we go. It will generally compile over here, and if I press 1, I will see all the outputs of this material. Notice that there's an outline to them. So if I grab, let's say, one of them, I'll grab every one of them, and they will be automatically hooked up to all the outputs. In this case, of course, if I want to just use the singular one, just press 1, allows me to grab one of them. Okay, so 1 by 1 is exactly what I want. In most cases, of course, depending on what kind of outputs you have. And this is essentially has to do something with the label, right? So if we take a look over here and simply open our reference, and yes, this is quite annoying. look at, well, not as complicated as the other ones. Let's remove these square bits. Yeah, I think square is much more readable. And if we take a look over here, let's say we've got a particular output, and it currently is a diffuse. There's a group material, group material, group material. So all of these things are grouped together. All of these outputs have their own group setup, which means that they also have the option of. Let me just close this. No, I don't want to save that thing. Sorry. which basically allows me to, whenever I have something that is grouped like that, they will be sort of together. Whenever you press 2, it will grab all of the things that are grouped together. You can have some of them grouped together and then others being sort of like away. Okay, so let's just delete this and continue onwards. Then you've got some settings here, which allows you to clean the things that you don't use. So if you got a particular, something that you're not using, you don't want to be hunting it down, just clean this stuff, it will get rid of it. You've got your timings, which is, I think it has to do something with animation. I never actually animated anything inside Designer, so I don't really know how that works. Then, of course, you've got your outputs. You can export them or re-export them. Generally speaking, whenever you're exporting outputs, you want to be setting a particular destination, and then this is your pattern, for example, the way you, which has to do something with the way you've defined your project settings in the Baker bit, and then you can just tick this over here. It'll automatically export whenever you change something. This would, for example, be used for Painter if you're using just the maps. However, generally speaking, you just want to be saving the substance, since you can just import it into Painter anyway. Okay. That being said, you've also got some settings here. You can choose obviously the 1, 2, 3 here. Just standard is the default one, or material compact, I think, is the default one. Then you've got the what's its face? I think this is the way you can add these toolbars over here. Yeah, so you can disable, enable them. You can check of the information here. For example, in this case, maybe I don't want the timings, and they will disappear, but I do want the timings. By the way, by default they're off, so make sure you have it. You can search for different nodes, assuming you know what you're looking for, and also you could sort of like export new graphs, and you can change the resolution to 1:1 or even more. Then this is essentially the last button is never used, since you can just do that by using F, I believe. Yeah, so by using F, it's just like using that button. Now, that being said, now that I got rid of this, saved a little bit more space, what am I going to do with all the stuff that we've lost? Well, essentially, I'm just going to press space, and everything I have here will be in the search bar available. Now, the reason I think this is a very powerful tool is because my entire library is also at my fingertips. Despite you not being able to see it, let's say I look for bricks. Oh, look at this. I've got bricks 01 and bricks 05, even though they're not part of the initial node setup over here. And that's basically like using this search over here. It's the exact same search, I think, actually. So definitely very useful, especially if you know exactly what you have in your library. Now, the reason the library even exists in the first place is so that you can take a look at different generators and say, oh, gee, right, maybe I want this noise, maybe I want that noise. Maybe I want, I just don't know how this looks like or how that looks like, or you can just create your own little library shelves over here, folders, and import your own alphas, requiring for you to just scan visually through them instead of just looking around. Not to mention that there's a bunch of stuff such as filters where, you just want to take a look at them and see what you've got, in terms of options. Now, I'm not a big fan of the way this, this whole thing works, simply due to the fact that the package is not a very big, at least in most of the time I work, the package is not a very big, sort of like window that I use. Okay, so I'm just gonna pop the 3D view out, and I'm gonna put it over here, and I'm gonna grab my library. I'm gonna put it over here. Where's my thingy? My library. There we go. And then in the Explorer over here, I'm just gonna grab my 2D view, and I will sort of make it smaller. Generally speaking, the best possible option, the best possibility would of course be to have my 2D view, here at the bottom. Sorry, here in the Explorer, so I could just mix between the two. As you can see, generally speaking, I should be able to. There we go. This is my Explorer here. So this is my preferred method of working, especially since it allows me to quickly sort of get rid of a lot of space, right? For example, this is what I want, and this is it takes a little bit of space, but everything else is neatly organized, especially my library, which allows me a much better view of what I've got instead of just scrolling around here like a blind man. So as you can see, there's loads of different different cool filters here, and if you know what they are, such as maybe you want to blur, all you got to do is just say, well, I want to blur. right? And you've got all these different blurs: anisotropic blur, you've got a grayscale blur, high quality. You can just get a regular blur. Now, here's the thing. Unfortunately, there's no way to collapse these, by the way, so it's quite unfortunate at this stage. Maybe in the future, when you click on them, you'll be able to sort of collapse them the same way you can do in Maya. Now, what is an atomic node, and what is the rest of these nodes? Now, first of all, if I press spacebar, notice that I only have these nodes over here. These are atomic level nodes. They're hard-coded, meaning that they're very, very optimized. Generally speaking, though, whenever you're looking at your hard codes, you want to be not be using a lot of blurs. Well, not a lot, just too many blurs or too many directional warps, since these are very intensive in terms of their calculations. So generally, these are the heaviest nodes to be used. After that, I think it's blend, and then you've got some I think after the blend, you've got some was it the sharpen? I think it's the sharpen. I'm not sure. But the point is that these are very fast. Okay, these are very fast and very efficient nodes, and you should use almost every time whatever it is in a node like this. Now, obviously, you can use these filters here, but they're a lot slower, and of course they're a lot higher quality when it comes to that. Also, in order to sort of keep your outputs in check, don't go ahead and use 16 bits every time you want. The only real reason to use 16 bits if you have a normal map, which will increase its resolution, sort of kind of like color range or just general crispiness, quite a lot. But regular color should stay at 8. And generally speaking, you really don't want to use color at all in the first place, since you want to be using a most of the time you want to be using a like a grayscale, okay? Because grayscales are very, very fast. Like a grayscale is very good at doing pretty much everything that a color does, and you only need to put a color on it at the end of your workflow. But I just like usually having just a color to see what it is I'm looking at right now. Of course, if we take a look at particular generators here, these are essentially dirt maps. Now, these are sort of functions on their own. You can even drill into them. Let's say I grab I don't know. Let's say I grab dirt 5, right? And let's go ahead and basically open the reference. Yes, I do want to open the reference. Now notice this is how the dirt 5 has been created. Now you can use the legacy bit as well, but the dirt essentially has an FX map and levels, and your output is the dirt. Obviously you can make your own. You don't even need this. You could just design your own dirt from whatever it is you have here. The reason, of course, you might want to be using the dirt because it's probably better done than yours, right? So it's most likely a much better a much more optimized and much better performed calculation setup. So there's not a lot of wasted space or nodes in that for that matter. And of course, you have some parameters which you can generally, basically grab here. If you take a look at your left here, you've got different stuff such as scale, different levels of disorder, and of course the non-square expansion if you decide to use, a non-square, not a power of 2 resolution. Okay, so for example, let's even say I want to use this dirt as something as a mask in this case, since of course it's black and white. And there we go, I have added this as a mask, and you should see now my colors being changed. Now what the cool thing about this is, if I go ahead and double click on my blend, right, and let's say I grab particular blending mode. Now notice these blending modes, by the way, you should be fairly well acquainted with them. So let's just go ahead and just go through them. I can see immediately the result in basically in the output. Let's say in this case I want to use screen or whatever. But imagine that I want to maybe do something different. Maybe I want to create a different dirt, a more realistic dirt. Let me just delete these over here, and let's just say I could, for example, blend these two dirts. Maybe I want to blend them, but I want them to be colored, right? Now what you could do is essentially color them with a grayscale, right? So a gradient map. So a gradient map, and in this case I will just change it to color over here, and I don't know, maybe I want to just simply add a particular color, let's say blue, and this of course be something like this. I think I'm currently, let me just clear all. let's say over here, I want to add one, something like this, right? And then my original one would be, oops, let's say I want it to be red or pinkish, right? Something like that. For example, this is my my gradient map. I'm even going to duplicate this over here, and I'm going to delete the connection. Connect this one. As you can see, my gradient map here, I will essentially, I'll perform something else. I'll just swap these around. Maybe I should also make this blue and this I don't know, greeny-ish. Okay, so I have two different gradients, and I need to hook them up here to see what I'm gonna see. Let's grab this over here, and let's grab this, put it over here, like so. As you can see, I've got a different blend here, mainly due to the fact that I've got a pretty shitty dirt. But of course, I'm currently in grayscale instead of color. Jesus Christ, it was automatically by color. The problem is, of course, that here there's really not that much stuff. Let me just increase the scale and maybe the disorder. Maybe even more the scale. So I got something like this, right? Currently, of course, I'm not really doing much. So let's go ahead and take a look if I use copy, maybe add sub or whatever. So I've definitely got a lot of stuff, and this is what controls it. If I increase the scale of that, I will get much finer detail over here, right? And I can increase this order as well. This will all change depending on what I set up here. So it's pretty cool. Of course, the gradient map, we're going to go over that in a little bit in the future. But generally speaking, when you press spacebar, you've got several settings. First, you've got the gradient map, which is what we currently use. Essentially, it allows you to add color to anything and everything. I don't even think, I think you do need almost always a particular input. Do you? No, you don't. So this doesn't even need an input. So that's pretty cool. So this is a gradient, okay? Also, you have your blend, which allows you to blend between two nodes. You've got your blur, which obviously clearly allows you to blur stuff. The directional blur simply uses an input to blur something in a particular direction. Sorry, just click the gradient map again. Directional blur, so that's what it does, right? You can take a look here. It takes an input, then it takes an output, and then you just have a particular angle in which you want to be blurring something. So if we grab the rope, for example, dump it into blur, and once we start blurring it, you should be able to see that there's the blur is in different directions depending on where I rotate this. Then you've got your bitmap, which is presumably something that you have as a resource instead of a file, but whatever floats your boat. I think no, there's no way to do that. Then you've got your hue, saturation, and lightness. This essentially gives you a particular output in terms of a color. So let's just grab the green one. Obviously, you can move around by pressing the middle mouse button. Zoom in and out at the cursor with the the wheel. Right mouse button for this stuff. Standard things. I'm not going to go over the most basic stuff ever. But as you can see, you can change the hue, for example. You can change the saturation. And the lightness, of course, depending. It's kind of like the gamma. So definitely a very powerful tool here. Then you've got your text, which is essentially the only way you can even choose a particular font. You can't do that in Painter. You can look, if you ever used Word, this text node should be fairly simple to understand. You've got your normal node, which takes an input and turns it into a normal. So in this case, let's say we have this dirt, and I'm going to grab it and simply dump it over here. And as you can see, we have a dirt. Now notice that it's a 16-bit normal map. The reason for this, of course, is that these are 16-bit outputs. In other words, they're essentially kind of like, everything is from parent, basically, right? Notice that it's on creation. Let me just, recompute them, sorry. On creation, this was an 18-bit, but generally speaking, since it is inheriting from its parent, it will go to where's my output format? There we go, to 8-bit right now, but it will go to 16-bit because it's relative to input instead of parent. And even if it was relative to parent, I think it's best you leave it at 16. Then you've got your let's say transformation 2D, which allows you to transform things depending on the way whichever way you look at it. Again, if we take a look at our use this rope over here, just dump it in this method here. As you can see, I can rotate it, do particular things with it, squish it, unsquish it, right? Fairly self-explanatory stuff. Of course, this isn't random. This is like deliberate. So if you want to do some random transformations, I think there was a special node for that. One more thing, there is actually a pretty cool way of adding stuff to to the node. Let's say I want to add a levels here, which is the next node we're going to go over anyway. And these are our levels, and will basically be hooked up. Of course, if I simply click on this and type levels, it will automatically be connected. Pressing delete will delete the node and the connection, whereas the pressing backspace will delete the node but will retain the connection. Of course, levels is a very universal bit, and there's a bunch of other pieces of similar functions that are using levels but are much more sort of robust depending on what you want to do, such as histogram scans, ranges. If you take a look here, you've got your range, scan, and I don't even know what that is. Select and shift, never used them before. Maybe they got something cool as well. But they're all basically a form of levels. For example, the scan has its own little position, which allows you, which kind of like scans through your histogram. You can even increase or decrease the contrast to get blurrier or less blurrier. You can even invert the position, get sort of like a reverse result of whatever it is you're looking at, since of course our position is pretty shit right now. There we go, I've inverted it. I'm going to delete this, and there's obviously other histograms such as histogram range, which is similar, but it's kind of like it's basically like the bottom bit of the levels, not the top. You might ask yourself, well, Jesus, why is that even needed? Well, this is mainly used for controls, to control the inputs and the outputs of whatever grayscale you have, since most of the time you'll be working with a grayscale, right? But let's just say for a moment that we want to be using our normal. Let's see what happens. I'm going to create an output. I'm going to add an item here and just going to look for normal. There's my normal. It's an RGBA. I'm just going to dump it over here, and I should see the output right like so. I believe if I actually view the outputs. There we go. These are our outputs. Notice that my normal is being applied almost pretty much immediately, and I've simply used a grayscale for it. I didn't even have anything I could use for it, and now I have something appropriate. Of course, this is all recomputable. Dirt is pretty slow, surprisingly, all because I've got a lot of scale. Okay, the point is, guys, that pretty much every node in this pile is useful. You can derive a curve, for example, a curvature. Sorry, you can create a curve. So it's kind of like a more advanced levels command. So if I input something and I can, let's say, play around with the curves. Come on, then I need to add a point actually first. So as you can see, I'm playing around with this curvature here, and I'm adding. It's kind of like not the levels, but I think there was a histogram or some kind of filter in Photoshop that was pretty much identical to what this is. Okay, and of course you can work on different channels. Presumably you should be able to work. Oh, because I only have a grayscale. Yeah. Okay, so that's just the curves. I believe you can derive a curvature. As you can see, you can just grab a curvature here and get it from let's say this particular one as well. There's our curvature, and you can have that basically as a you can have that as an output. All right, so just know that for a moment. Then you've got, of course, we currently have a gradient map. All right, then you've got by the way, I have no idea how to dock these together, just the way you saw. All right, so in this case, if I had a curvature, and I grabbed, of course, this, and since this is a grayscale, you can even see the gray sort of connector, and I'm dumping it into a thing that takes actually a normal, which is a color. It will create a gradient conversion. Now I really don't know how to do that unfortunately, in terms of the way you can dog these together. So if I delete this, you will notice that the gradient map still exists. So I do need to create to add some color to it. Generally speaking though, well, you don't really need it all the time here. There must be a way to do this. I'm not sure how. Then you've got the you got the pixel processor. It's a little bit more complicated. You got the distance, essentially. Even look, there's these nice tooltips. Whenever you go over this, it will give you a good idea of the standard vector graphics, the uniform color, the warp, the emboss. These are all pretty standard things. The inputs and the outputs, of course, the comments, the frames, and the pins. I'm really not going to dive into very deep with these things. This is just essentially you need a lot of, not a lot, but a little bit of experimentation. And really, if you know, like if you know the terms, you know the language, whenever you click on something, let's say the SVG, and when I click but hover over it, and you can see the description. The vector graphics filter takes a vector graphic image and inserts it into a graph as a bitmap. Very, very simple, very clean, very clear explanation. There's not a lot of, doubt what it does. The main real issue comes from really learning your library and exploring your filters, and really creating such filters on your own. Let's say a mosaic filter, and you might be asking, oh, how do I get that? Well, open the reference and take a look. This is it. So if you want, you could, let's say you want to create something and look at how it's done. First of all, you got a mosaic map, which is an 8-bit image. Then you've got a color map, and then you got a warp, and a warp, and a warp, a warp, a warp, a warp, loads of different warps. And then you got the same thing blended over and over and over and over and over together. And then, of course, output it at the, the final output by being blended with the initial result. In other words, the color. So really, there's really not that much mystery when it comes to how things work. You can make them yourself if you really want to. That being said, I really don't think it's it's necessary for you to go ahead and to be making these, since generally most of the time you'll be having your own. Again, these filters are the only difference between a filter and a material is that instead of let's say in this case, for example, let's say this is my material, right? And it has a particular input, a particular set of maps. Well, I could just create an input, let's say grayscale. I would need 3 of these, right? And they would be, I would obviously go ahead and define a particular setup here, such as, well, my specific parameters for the packages, for example, what kind of usage these things would be, right? If we take a look here, this would probably be something like, since, of course, the inputs have to be correspondent with the outputs. Now, I'm not going to bother with this because I'm not going to be setting this up, but I think you can clearly see how they work at this point, right? This is a grayscale input. It goes ahead and gets dumped into the gradient map. It also gets dumped into the normal map. And then this is gone. That's it. No more. Then you've got the same thing over here, which is kind of something like a dirt. Put it in the gradient map and just get rid of this one. And then, of course, the same thing applies for this particular one, which would be, for example, the mask for your blend. Dump it over here. Get rid of the dirt. And as you can see, you're pretty much, you're fairly well set up. Now, this is a filter, okay? This is a filter now. Well, sort of, because it takes something and it outputs something, and then whatever something can work with that. All right. So whatever you set up here, you can export it as a filter and save it as a filter. All right. Okay. So I think this is really as much as I'm gonna go as like in terms of the depth. So we've went over the UI. We went over what these nodes are, highly advanced. Highly optimized basic atomic nodes, which sort of create really the bulk of the workflow that you'll be using. Generally, you'll be using blends, blurs, directional warps, all that jazz, and most of the time you'll be using just filters and generators. Of course, the FX map is one of the more complicated one, especially since we need to go ahead and edit inside and see what the story is. I really haven't been playing nearly as much as I need to have, since it's a very powerful tool. But to each his own. And there's there's always a time for it. Obviously, if we click edit, you will see that it's a very different setup. There's quadrants, there's different things. I really have no idea what they are. So we got a quadrant and switch and an iterate. And I've watched a couple of videos, I've read a couple of stuff, but I generally have no clue how to use this. As far as I know, you have one shape, and then with that one shape, you start just doing something with it. But of course, feel free to play around with it, and if you get a particular result, good for you, since it's a very powerful tool. And any pattern that is not available for you in the generators tab, most of these generators are created through the FX map anyway. Not to mention that they're different, different FX materials, filters, I believe. Is there matte FX? Not sure. I think that's what this. I think that wasn't Painter. Anyway, as you can see, loads of potential, huge, absolutely ridiculous amounts of well, kind of like variety, right? This is a very randomized, this is a very robust package. So it's up to you guys to really play around with it and to define yourself to say, well, do I really need it? In general speaking, Like I said, we don't really need it in our case, but I really want to just go over it real quick. In the next video, we will go ahead and create the sand for our material, sorry, for our terrain, and that will be the end of that. So, but depending, of course, on your project, if you have something that needs to be scalable, right, something that needs to be really scalable, right, that you can apply this. For example, whatever you make here, you can apply it to a terrain, to a door. Like let's say you made some wood, could be applied to a door, could be applied to a house, to a wardrobe, really anything wooden. So you know, definitely whenever you're doing something, make sure to think about it, right? Do I need this to be as reusable as possible, or do I need this to be simply, do I need just this one-off and I'm going to use painter? Or maybe you can create the wood and substance and then paint on top of it with painter, right? Whatever floats your boat. Of course, setting up the version control depends on entirely on what kind of project you have, and if you have a lot of substances, if you will be working a lot with Designer. All right, so that's that, guys. I'll see you next time when we go ahead and create the sand for the terrain, and we'll be pretty much done with Designer, and then we'll dive into Painter real quick until we go back into Unreal. All right, bye bye.